tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Now, getting right back into the thick of things, yesterday we did the retrospective on 1 year since the Emergencies Act, and it's impossible to talk about the Emergencies Act and the Freedom Convoy without the broader question of what context gave birth to those things, and that was at the time 2 years and a little bit of COVID policy in Canada, which has been analyzed in a newly expanded book by Barry Cooper and Marco Navarro Gini called Canada's COVID, the Story of a Pandemic Moral Panic. Now, we are supposed to be talking to Marco and Barry, although Marco seems to have drifted off into the ether. So, Barry, the floor is yours solo for the first little while here. It's good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, you're welcome, Andrew. The first edition came out in November of 2020. And it dealt with events up to about the beginning of the fall. We discovered that it didn't end in November 2020, and there was so much more interesting stuff that came along over the next 18, 20 months that we decided we would keep notes as things were going on and pull this new expanded version together. The main purpose of it is to document I don't know how to characterize it politely, but let's say the mendacious acts of governments and government bureaucrats, the media, academics, particularly guys in the medical schools, that otherwise it'll be forgotten 10 years from now because there won't be any record. There'll be a remembrance maybe that some people didn't like the government responses. But we basically provided an analysis about why people didn't like it because of the lies that were told by bureaucrats, by docs, and especially by politicians and the mainstream media. That was the purpose of it.
One of the things, just to go back to January 2020 here, that I think is important to note is that, we were looking at the people in the lab coats and the people in the suits on television as being authorities on what was happening, but they were largely getting their information from the same place as we were. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what was happening. They were looking at the news footage out of China, eventually Italy and Iran. And I think that was a big problem, is that they seemed to be a lot more confident than they should have been. And I think that was where a lot of that public trust was eroded quite early on.
Yeah, I agree. That's exactly what happened because the rest of us could read the sources that, not that very many people did, mind you, but it was certainly available. It wasn't hidden. And the behavior, particularly of, let's say, senior people in the interface between government policy and the rest of us, chief medical officers of health in this country, people like Tony Fauci in the States, what they said was being contradicted by other people who are just as well credentialed as they are. So in many cases, much better. They actually knew what they were talking about. And the result was, since the rest of the world could read this stuff, people just didn't believe them anymore. It took a while. Anybody who believes anything that comes out, say, of Bonnie Henry's mouth right now, is just gullible as a frog. I mean, I don't know why anyone would after she's been criticized on the basis of facts for so long.
I believe we might have Marco back on the line now. So if so, hopefully he'll magically appear in front of us and we will be able to carry on. If not, we'll put you on the hot seat for a couple more minutes and get him on momentarily. All right, it seems there's an issue where he is not appearing. So Marco, if you are there, perhaps you can try reconnecting and we'll get you in here. And I apologize for the technical issues. This is the nature of live broadcasting. Barry, your background is obviously in political science, and I think one of the interesting things that a lot of people pointed out and government officials didn't really acknowledge ever, and still to this day have not, is that their actions seem to be largely driven by political science rather than health science, and not the good, astute political science that you are a purveyor of, but oftentimes a more cynical and less freedom-oriented variety. And I think this is the big problem that I had with it, is that health policy was, and by that I mean the stuff that was being put out by public health officials like Theresa Tam or Dina Hinshaw, Bonnie Henry, and so on. These people have a singular focus. They're not constitutional scholars. They're not holistic health officials that are looking at the broader implications of their policy. They were looking at largely the single metric of cases and nothing else. So if their input was being treated as one of many inputs throughout COVID, and politicians were also taking in inputs from other places, I think there might have been different results. But instead, what we seemed to see was a complete delegation of all decision-making to these unelected people.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if this was in fact an emergency, there are people around who prepare their work environment to deal with emergencies. The first thing that happened in Edmonton was the Alberta Emergency Plan was tossed out the window. Nobody paid any attention to it at all, like zero.
But why have it? Why have an emergency plan if you're not going to use it when there's an emergency, right?
That's exactly right. And this was almost unique because when you have, say, an earthquake in, the Lower Mainland, and Chilliwack is rocked to its roots. You don't call upon geographers or volcanologists. You talk upon emergency people and ask them to take charge. And that presumably BC still has an emergency plan in place. They just didn't use it for this emergency. We certainly have it, and we didn't use it. Every other province in the country probably had one, and none of them used it. I would say it brings up issues that have nothing to do with either emergencies or health policy. It has to do with the anxieties that were clearly present in the politicians. They had no clue what to do, and so they basically freaked out and said, "Okay, it's about health. What do you say, Dina? Why should she know anything? I mean, she's an MD. She's not an emergencies person. She's not even a real med scientist. She's not an epidemiologist. She's just an MD from U of A. Why should she do it?" Or Bonnie Henry, the same thing. It's a political. That's why we call it a panic. It was a political panic that caused all of the incredible amount of suffering that Canadians have put up with for the last, now going on to 3 years. And it's completely unjustifiable on medical or any other grounds.
Is your belief that I'll ask this in a different way, because one theory that I've had is that they were pot committed at a certain point, and they had invested so much in their narrative that they didn't actually have the ability to walk it back without just completely undermining anything they'd been telling us for the last 2 and eventually 3 years. But the flip side of that is that they're true believers, and that even now the people that have been championing the policies that you're poking holes in, rightfully so, they still believe and will to their dying day that they were the right calls. And I'm curious if you have a sense of which camp they're in. Do you think that they got so far into it that they couldn't walk it back anymore, or do you think they're still true believers?
They can be both, quite frankly. I came from a medical family, and one of the things, my dad was a surgeon, my sister was a doc. One of the things that you learn pretty clearly is that doctors, particularly when they have responsibility for life and death, don't generally take much second thoughts. They have a job to do. They do it. They're not really good at reflecting on whether or not they've done the right thing, and that's certainly true for these sort of, it's not even fair to call them second-rate docs, but the bureaucratic docs keep the same attitude without the same competence. And so then when you have people who are genuinely expert in some of these matters, like the people who who signed the Great Barrington Declaration that said you got to look after the people who are vulnerable, not everybody. These were the three big universities in the world: Oxford, Harvard, and Stanford. That's where these guys were from. Dina Henshaw said, "Oh, we disagree." Like that was it. She probably didn't even understand what these guys were saying, and because at the time she had the ear of the premier, nothing happened. They just continued the same kind of let's say misguided, to be polite about it, policies that they had already put in place.
I know to get to the bigger picture, and I'd say the more philosophical underpinning of this, I know that the book's blurb draws a reference to Hannah Arendt, who, the author of the famous book, The Banality of Evil, and her thoughts on bureaucratic tyranny. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, that's one of my, I've memorized this, and I've mentioned it in class, I don't know how many times. It was not actually in the Eichmann book, but it was in another place that she says the great problem with bureaucratic tyranny, unlike any other kind of tyranny, is that the desperate remedy of tyrannicide is unavailable. If you get rid of one bureaucrat, they will be replaced by another one who will behave, the other one will behave in exactly the same way. So it really is a problem. I mean, you can get rid of bureaucrats, which is fine. I mean, that's one of the first things that Danielle Smith did, was to fire Dina Henshaw. She should have been fired by Jason Kenney. He'd probably still be premier if he'd had the imagination to do that. Unfortunately, he didn't. Well, unfortunately for him, it's obviously good for Danielle, but it was the amount of consistent errors that bureaucrats are capable of. You actually have to know something about how public policy is made in order even to believe it. And it was in this particular instance was really remarkable. They just kept doing the same stupid thing time and time again.
Yes, and I think, your point about Jason Kenney, I think is an important dimension here, because there was very little, some might even say no, pushback to the overarching narrative, regardless of which province you were in, and whether you had a conservative or a liberal or a new Democratic premier. And Jason Kenney, again, at the time, a lion of the conservative movement going into COVID. Doug Ford, again, a recent conservative electee in Ontario. They ended up doing the same as the NDP did elsewhere in British Columbia, as Francois Legault did in Quebec. To some extent, they went even further than that in Ontario. But there really was no escape from this across the country. And I'm wondering if when you were analyzing this, you saw any major regional variance, or if it was really that everyone was singing from the same songbook.
It was a remarkable deference of elected politicians, whatever side of the spectrum they were on, to the alleged expertise of self-proclaimed experts. And toward the end of the book, we started reflecting on Tocqueville, the great 19th century democratic theorist. And he makes the point that fear is inherent in democracies, and that politicians can see this, and because they are not immune from the attractions of increasing their power, are quite willing to use fear to do so, and particularly when it's fed up to them by alleged medical experts. It's a dish that they could not refuse sampling, and they certainly did, and it had nothing to do with their previous ideological predispositions.
One of the challenges of a book like this coming out now is that there obviously has been now 3 years of material to analyze, but I also wonder, and this is an issue I grapple with even on this show when I decide what I'm talking about, if people are less willing or less, mentally capable of dwelling in this period. So I guess my question would be, do you and Marco hope that this book sort of closes the book on COVID in Canada to move forward, or do you really think there still needs to be the beginning of a reckoning?
I'm sure that I can speak for Marco on this. We'd like it to be the beginning of a reckoning. It is a record of what happened, but it is also a kind of, not exactly a prediction, but nothing that we have seen, particularly from the government of Canada, shows any sense of how they've completely screwed up. that has never, I'm sure, entered the tiny mind of the Prime Minister that he has anything to apologize for. And in fact, he seems to be doubling down on the kinds of errors that were implicit in the lockdowns.
Well, and just to interrupt you there, Barry, today, I believe it was Laurier University in Ontario announced that it was ending its mask mandate, which, again, a lot of people are saying too little, too late. But there's no recognition when they do this that they got it wrong. It's, well, now the science supports us doing this, is basically their answer. So even when they lift these things, there's never any contrition that comes along with it.
No, that's right. I mean, the experts are never wrote. This is the thing we have to remember.
That could have been the title of the book right there, I think.
One of the things that I wrote this particular chapter, so I remember it, about masks, and it was somebody in the States who'd actually did a big meta-analysis of I don't know, 70 or 80 studies of masks, and he came to the conclusion that masks are as useful against COVID as chain link fences are against mosquitoes. And I thought, yeah, and people who had looked at the evidence, had looked at the actual research, would know that. And if you hadn't looked at the research, if you were a medical officer of health in this province or in this country and you didn't know what the research was, you just weren't doing your job. And I don't know which it was. I've never talked to any of the three Graces that you mentioned earlier, whether they actually knew anything or they just decided on their own without any evidence. It could be either way.
Yeah, and I think just on the masks alone, I remember at the beginning when Theresa Tam was telling everyone not to wear masks, and then eventually it became illegal to not wear a mask, and now we're back to it being a choice and mandates not helping, and it's easy to get a little bit of whiplash on this. So let's hope you get the beginning of the reckoning, and not just you and Marco, but I think all Canadians here. I apologize for whatever technical issues were affecting this. We'll happily get Marco on the show next week to broaden this discussion. The book, Canada's COVID, the Story of a Pandemic Moral Panic, an expanded edition by Barry Cooper and Marco Navarro-Jani. So, Barry, thank you so much. And Marco in absentia, I thank him as well, but it's great to talk to you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.